Thank you very much. And thank you, Madeline, for the loving words, and particularly the time for Miriam. And I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm so glad to see you. And I am hoping I'll also be here with you. But that remains to be seen as to how my mind rolls into what I'm going to be saying. But I want to talk about the concept of the comparison of the novel with psychotherapy, because there are so many there are so many avenues for exploring what a human being is. That's right in my eyes. That's it. Can you tell? You can see when I shaved last. And I really rather keep that a secret. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. But all the explorations we have, this miracle of minds, that my mind cares about what's in your mind. And not only cares about it, but spends a whole lifetime trying to understand what it is. And so many of the professions do that. Certainly anthropologists do it. Philosophers do it. People of religion do it. Even people in physics make some effort to discover, to take account of the personal error in measurements. So we're all trying to find out what's going on in other people. And the novelists, I believe, stand high among all the options for people whom we honor as explorers of the nature of humanness, what it's like to be a human being. And so since their work in so many ways is similar to ours, I think it might be worth looking at what some of those particular ways are. Not that we will then guide ourselves to being novelists, but perhaps taking more full advantage than we might otherwise for what they have to teach us in terms of what we do. So just to deal with some of the similarities, I want to caution you. I planned this. And I even have a transparency that shows you that I planned what I was going to say, but people who know me know that that's not how it's going to work. And it could work like that. I'll stick as close as I can to what I intended, but I hope I don't become compromised by that goal. And so if I lose track somehow with what's up there, let's see if we can help each other out on that, and maybe Etta can help me along with that also in terms of where we're trying to go, because I do want to cover the things that I had in mind to cover. Are you able to understand me okay? Am I speaking at a good enough speed, or any problems about it? Should we have some translation? Well, if at any point, pardon me? Louder? Oh, I thought the technology was going to take care of that. Higher? Well, I can speak louder. I am a soft-spoken person, and sometimes in our training program at the beginning, people will say to me, "I can't hear you." And I say, well, I have the option of speaking more loudly, and you'll be able to hear me, but I won't know what I'm saying. Or I assure you that as time goes on and my energy catches up with me, that I get louder, and I think it probably will be okay. I hope so. If not, let me know again. But also, if any of you have any difficulty with certain translations, I know it's hard for people in an audience to suddenly say, hey, I didn't really get the sense of that word. I think people, if you might take a rule that if you didn't understand it, at least 30 other people didn't. And if you have that equation in your mind, you might be more free to speak up and get the clarification. And I certainly won't mind, because I'm looking for contact with you anyway. It's very lonely up here otherwise. But in any case, so one of the things that novelists and therapists do similarly is they seek a theme. They seek some theme that will have some special emphasis and continuity. And in preparing this, I remembered something that Chekhov once said, which was that if you see a rifle on the wall in the first act, by the third act, somebody's going to get shot. And it's that kind of implication system that heightens the experience of therapy, perhaps not as much so on an everyday basis in therapy as it does in a novel, but at certain particular moments it does indeed considerably heighten the experience of therapy, to have a sense that everything that is said counts. There's no place to hide. There's no rest. It's not true, because there are plenty of times to rest. In fact, just to change the subject a little bit, one time, just to honor my free association, you stay with me on it. One patient came in, I see people one after the other, and he said, "When do you rest?" And I said, "I rest when I'm working with you." Fortunately, he knew the humor of it. But so there is a loosening up of the therapeutic process. We mustn't keep it totally tight, but a large part of therapy is quite tight. So in a novel that I read recently called Atonement, perhaps some of you have read it, perhaps not. It's a story about a 13-year-old girl, very precocious in her writing talents, beautiful writer, but quite hysterical and narcissistic also. And a series of events transpires, and somebody has gotten raped. And she is in a position of being the one who had seen this person, and points out a person whom it wasn't. And he finally gets, I won't go into the details, but he gets convicted and is sent to prison, and there are a series of events that are very torturous and tragic that go on. But the theme of the novel basically is, is there some way for her to have made atonement? And what would atonement be composed of? Like, she spent the rest of her life trying to write a novel about this event. Is that atonement? Yes. Atonement. Atonement is a form of forgiveness. Pardon me?
Sühne.
Sühne. Got it? Okay. Yes. Thank you. Well, what a complex phenomenon. She never revealed publicly who the fact that she had mistakenly named this man. So he died, and terrible things happened, but where was her atonement, even though she had wrestled with this the rest of her life? Does one have to give restitution in order for atonement to exist? Does one have to simply take the direct meaning of the word atonement, which is sort of at one meant, and if one becomes whole, one has atoned? In other words, there are a number of philosophical, psychological issues involved, but the fundamental thing is the theme that pervaded the book. And in psychotherapy, we also develop themes, and sometimes they're very minor themes, and sometimes they're very large themes. So I'm thinking of one particular very small theme. A patient says, "I had coffee with sort of a friend the other day." Well, the therapist's ear is turned to, sort of a friend? I mean, there must be a story there. Nobody says sort of a friend if they're not, in some way, not revealing an important part of what's going on. And so in exploring it, it turns out that She's been having an affair with this friend. It was a turning point in her life. And through this relationship, she gave up depending on men. So there we have a therapeutic type of experience which builds on a particular thematic structure, which is revealed by a very simple statement in the course of the therapy. So I remember a long time ago when I was doing group therapy in my office, people would gather together and have very good conversation with each other. And then at a certain point, as the leader of the group, I knew that it was time to start, so I said, well, let's start now. So you know what happens when someone says, let's start now. Nobody had anything to say. So at first, for a while I was thinking, well, I've just stopped the flow of the music. And it's hard to get the music started again. And that's a natural thing, and maybe that's part of the reason. But I think another reason is that once the therapist says, let's start now, there's no longer capricious conversation. Everything counts. And suddenly everybody is very more cautious about what they will or what they won't produce. So, Proust had the observation that one of the characteristic things about a novel is that it speeds life up. In other words, everything that happens goes faster. It's another way of saying that everything counts. But with Proust is an odd example of that because it's very hard to tell when you're reading Proust that everything is counting or that he's speeding up life. But the fact is that when you're reading a novel, you don't have to wait 6 months before you discover whether somebody got rescued from the Himalayas. You might read it overnight. And one can bear that, but we in therapy have to deal with consequences which are very problematic and which can't be handled right away. So there's that added suspense that therapy is caught in, of not knowing how it's going to turn out. Now, both the therapist and the novelist, and I'm still, we can go to the next. The second similarity that I want to mention is the selection of themes. And both novelists and therapists have a wide variety of themes which they call upon to guide the therapeutic work. And I'm thinking in particularly of the idea of getting the right story, because we have no lack of stories in psychotherapy. But many of the stories are either repetitive, they're irrelevant to the purposes of the therapy, they're distorted based on memories that don't fit the original scene. They're told fourth or fifth hand. There are a number of problems the therapist has to deal with in getting at the right story. And I'm thinking in particularly of a woman whom I've seen recently who had the misfortune of, she was very good friends with a couple. And the man in the couple committed suicide horrendously without leaving a note. It was a tragic circumstance for all concerned, and certainly especially for the wife, whom my patient was trying to be warm with, supportive with, helpful with. She would do anything she could to help her over this struggle. And this went on for several months, and she would always return to the same story, which is very hard to dismiss because it was a very valid story, but it was a story which was only one part of her life. And while she's telling this story, for having repeated it a number of times, in trying to see whether anything else is going on in her life, it turns out that she just got engaged to be married to the man she's been with, and she hadn't known whether it was going to go or not, and she was overjoyed about it. And she was able to come into her sense of joy in telling the story of her relationship with her fiancé. Now, when people get caught in a bind, which many of the people we work with do, because they're more oriented towards solving a particular problem than experiencing those more positive things that are going on in their lives. And they really think of therapy frequently as a place where you do nothing but tell about your problems. But you can't solve problems only by talking about problems. Problems have to have a context. They have to be part of a life. You're not solving only a problem, you're dealing with a lifetime. So you have to be tuned into trying to get the right story. Now, how would anybody know what the right story is? Well, I'm not obviously going to give you the answer to that in any precise way, except that you all get a sense of, this is not the right story with many of the people we work with. Now, sometimes you can't do anything about it, because if they're obsessed, you have to deal with the obsessive quality and not simply change the subject. But if you can move the storyline into a new direction gradually enough so that you're not violating the person's focus, then they will come into new stories and it will broaden their life. And I'll say more in relation to that about the pain-drama ratio. Are we on the same page now? Pain-drama? Yeah, okay, pain-drama ratio. Well, okay, gee, that's terrific. Pain-drama. One may not ordinarily think of that as a ratio, but if we do, we could see it somewhat like this, that pain is a very narrowing experience. Pain is there to heighten experience. In fact, let me read you a passage that might help clarify better than I can at the moment. I'll take the liberty of reading one passage. It will take a couple of minutes from a book that I wrote about 15 years ago called Every Person's Life is Worth a Novel. And there's this particular passage that deals with the pain-drama ratio that I think will give some illumination about what I'm trying to say when I try to say that part of our job is to turn pain into drama. Now, that may sound harsh, and it may sound like trivializing pain, but I don't mean to trivialize it, and I think you'll understand that I'm not trivializing it, but that nevertheless that is a part of the human condition to try to transform pain into, one way to put it would be drama. And here's what I said about that. In the death of a son, dramatic when it occurs in a novel, is nothing less than traumatic in actual life. In the face of the pain, little attention is left for those other realities which may ultimately provide shape, meaning, proportion, or even inspiration to the suffering person. For those who are in pain, the pain is all that counts. There is a figurative swelling which forms around the pain, ensuring that this presently assimilable experience will receive all the attention it has coming. The swelling, by guaranteeing attention, is a barrier between the experience of pain and all other experiencing. Those who try to restore perspective will only be rushing fruitlessly toward an unlikely rapprochement. Resolution depends on an evolving series of phenomena, all serving to release the individual from confinement to the painful event. It is only after the pain is lessened that the drama inherent in the tragedy may be honored. That is to say, once the painful event, whether current or remembered, is restored to membership in the whole of the person, the conditions for drama are formed. The event comes to accentuate a valid, though scarred, existence. This confirmation of existence, forged out of a severely narrowed consciousness, is the nucleus of drama. From this nucleus, one may expand beyond the nullifying prospect of pain, eclipsing it by seeing once again the actual range of what matters. So we're all dealing with a very prominent and compelling phenomenon when we're dealing with people who, for one reason or another, for some frequency or another, are in pain. And we have to find some way of getting the trust relationship that is not limited to psychotherapists, because novelists require it also. I heard an interview with John Ervin, an author who's written a number of novels. He was being interviewed, and he said he once got a letter from a reader of his, very angry with him, telling her that she had trusted him. And she was reading his book, and he got her into hot water, hotter than she ever bargained for, and she didn't like it one bit. Now, novelists very often get you into hot water that way. So the line to draw for the novelist between what's too much and what's just right for the experience of vicariously knowing the pain of the people in the novel, the line to draw is not a clear line, but there is a line to be drawn. And I've read a number of novels, one of which was John Irving's, which took me into a region that I felt it was, I thought it was unskilled of him to take me into that area, that he was being overzealous about his point, and he shouldn't have done that. Now, you might feel very differently. We all would have different levels of that. But never forget that the novelist does have that problem. And if he's a poor novelist, he'll not take it into account, and he'll get you into all kinds of things which are not organically right for you to be in. And the same is true for the therapist. You have to be able to deal with therapy in a way which inspires people to move forward, but doesn't press them into situations which are too much for them to handle. None of us can know where that line is, and we all have to deal with some risk on that dimension. And normally we have a number of ways of trying to ensure ourselves that the risk will be well taken. If we're very mindful of the person's own process, we tend to feel, well, nobody's going to get themselves into that kind of trouble, will they? Well, I've seen people who will. And I know that I have, in spite of my Gestalt background and the respect for the person's own process, told the person, no, I don't. I think that's too much. Let's not go there. Because the person's self-regulatory mechanism may or may not be operating validly or successfully. After all, people come to us with more or less excellent self-regulatory systems. And the theory is that we are all self-regulatory, that none of us is ever going to do anything that's bad for ourselves, because our self-regulation would take care of that. How do you like that for something that would contradict all of your experiences in life? You've all found your self-regulation to be faulty at times, I would imagine. Certainly I have. But so we mustn't rest on the theory of self-regulation, not to have some sensibility for when a person is going too far. Well, there's this one person whom I worked with, I'll tell you about it in a moment. Not a moment, I'm going to tell you about it right now, unless something intervenes that I don't know about. This is a man who was quiet during most of the day in a therapy group. It was a day-long experience. And I knew I didn't want him to leave without saying anything. I believed if he didn't have something to say, that he would feel very bad after leaving. And I wanted him to say something, at least something simple, like hello, or give us some short story or something. But as we began working, more and more it became apparent that he was being very abstract. He was not giving any kind of storyline. So I told him a little story about my life. I don't remember exactly what it was, where I came from and something like that. Where do you come from? And finally he wound up telling me a story that was hair-raising, and I needed it even then. But it was a story about his life as a child, having thought he had cystic fibrosis, which the only way he discovered he didn't have it was when he survived, because the diagnosis was made incorrectly. Well, as he was telling the story, he came and he closer and closer he sat to me, and finally when he came out with the climax of it, he burst into spasmodic crying and fell into my arms, and I held him while he was crying. And that worked out in a way where the pain became assimilable, because the story he told represented the underpinnings of the pain, and the discovery was that the pain was not so severe that he couldn't be joined by others and be a person in the world, even though that pain existed. But there again, you have a judgment call in terms of how far you go with a particular person. But in the long run, when the story comes forth and the support is there and the story is not distorted, and all the other things you know a lot more about in therapy than what I'm going to be able to talk with you about today, all of those factors enter into making the story a substantive restoration of the nature of his existence, an existence which can encompass pain and does not have to leave him isolated. Now, those are some of the similarities between the novel and therapy. Orient me about time.
20 minutes, well, 3/4 of an hour, but 20 minutes until you'll...
20 minutes until I'm done. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to name these 4 purposes of telling stories. One is bridging the distance between ourselves and the people who matter to us. And I'm thinking in particular of one example. And of course, we all are either the tellers or the listeners of stories all the time. But some people are very spare, very stingy with their stories. And I'm thinking of one particular person whose father was a famous person who, I don't remember whether he wrote an autobiography or told his story to a biographer. But my patient read this biography, autobiography, whichever it was, and was incensed that she was discovering things about her father which he had told to strangers, not only in the interview, but published in a book that he had never told her. And though he had done many other things that were troublesome to her, this was what mattered the most, that he had not told her these stories of his life and had been willing to tell it to others. So it's just one example of how powerful the joining of minds is by virtue of the telling of stories. And the second purpose is to register you. One is to bridge the distance. I think I said that. The register experience. Now, you're all familiar. If you can think of your day today, how many stories you've heard, and how much it has meant to you to hear those stories. That your relationships wouldn't be anything without them. And sometimes you don't even know you're telling a story, you're just being together, but they're basically stories. Where you went, what you, like when I saw Madeline this morning, I think Cordula was there, maybe Eddie was there, I don't remember. The first thing I told them was how my journey into, oh yeah, you guys led me there. Alfred led me, I told them that before I left San Diego, I had a cap which I adored, and I left it someplace. Either I left it in a restaurant or I couldn't find it. And I thought, while I'm in Vienna, it'd be a nice memory of Vienna if I could find a cap that would be colorful. So they didn't exactly know where to go, and we had just a few minutes, but they took me to a place, it was about a 15-minute walk, and we did it. And this person, they showed me, well, there were 3 caps. And I didn't know which one to take, so I bought all 3 of them. So I've got them in my room right now, and I'm going to take those back to San Diego with me. And in a way, I'll be taking Vienna with me. But anyway, the registering of experience is accomplished partly through storytelling. My secretary and I did a strange thing a while ago. We asked 12 people this question. You can't count this as a research study, but it will reveal something of what I'm saying about registration of experience. We asked 12 people, and out of those 12 people, what we asked them was, if your house was on fire, and there's only one thing you could take out of your house, what would it be? Out of the 10 responses, 10 said there are things that actually registered their lives. They reported things like photos, wedding albums, journals, things like that. And out of the other 2, one said a pet, and the other said nothing. The most important things are inside, which is also a form of registration, only it's a ready-made registration. But in that small sample, I think it's not a peculiar sample. I think if I ask you folks now, what would you take out if your house was on fire and you had to go and you could only take one thing? I'm not going to ask you to tell me now, but I'll bet most of you would take something that had something to do with registering your life. And it's the registration of life that makes a huge difference in terms of the relationship between what we in Gestalt therapy would refer to as action versus awareness. Like, you can have all the action in the world, and if it never registered, you're going to be hungry. Hungry for more action, usually, hoping maybe the action would do it. And of course, it is true, happily, that the human system is so integrated that if you have good action, you're probably going to have good awareness. You know, you're not guaranteed of it. But there is a reciprocal relationship between the sensory motor systems that calls for specialization in one, recorded by the other. Okay, now connectedness is another purpose of the story. And the connectedness is not only a connectedness between person and person, which is, of course, very important, but it's also a connectedness among the events of your life. That your life then doesn't have a merely capricious, spasmodic character. It has a sense of direction, it has a sense of meaning, it has a sense of coherence. You have a feeling like you know where you've been and you know where you're going. And then there's the example that I gave the other day about Hansel and Gretel dropping the breadcrumbs and having the birds eat the breadcrumbs, and where were they? Well, many of us do the same thing. We drop the breadcrumbs. We drop the breadcrumbs, but somebody eats them, usually ourselves. Or we don't know where we dropped them, and suddenly we don't know, what is this life about? Where have I been and where am I going? And the story is a major component of the restoration of that kind of connectedness within and the directionalism that connectedness involves. And then a fourth example of a purpose that the storytelling has is the recurrence of life. Every time you tell a story, you're living your life again, in a way. And I think whoever did this, every one of us could have designed a better way of going around, where you just go around once. I mean, it's just not human to live once. So, but human beings get by it partly with storytelling and partly with their fantasies, excuse me for using the word because it may sound pejorative, of afterlife and other kinds of phenomena which assure us that we will live again. And it is very important for us to feel that we are going to live again. I feel it strongly. I don't believe it, but I would like a chance at designing it. But many of you may actually believe it, and I'm sure all those who believe in reincarnation believed it. Nietzsche believed it with his concept of recurrence, that everything happens over and over again in life. I think there's something about the, I've forgotten the term of the particular quality within that's repeated in every cell of our body. What is that called again? Well, never mind. No, not DNA, but that's getting closer. It's the kind of a programmed view of life that's represented everywhere. What? Hologram. Yeah, that's it, hologram. That's right. Hologram is not exactly living again, but it certainly has some aspect of one thing can die in, you've still got it in the other. And there's an old German expression which said, einmal ist kein Mal. Is that a familiar expression? And it is said that if 50,000 people perished on the plains of Spain in a certain year and it never happened again or anything like it, who would care? But we care because it happens over and over and over again. So stories are one other vehicle for the recurrence in life. How much time? 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Am I going to come out even? Do any of you like to have eat the last bite of your plate? You know, like you don't have a lot left over in one bite of something. But anyway, I don't know whether that's relevant or not. I just want to get away from this. This is really what I want to do. But okay, the next thing is, how do you evoke stories? And there are ways of evoking stories that we are all engaged in as we do therapy. And of course, one of the ways is to be hospitable to stories. If you love stories, you'll hear stories. Of course, in therapy, you're going to hear stories anyway because it's built for people to tell stories, although not everybody does. With some people, it is very difficult to draw out any storyline. And there's a lot of modernity, even among novelists, that says stories are things of the past. We don't care about stories anymore. And Gestalt therapy, as a matter of fact, started out with a heavy emphasis on process rather than content. So in the beginning, when we didn't know any better, we used to say, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. Well, that's crazy, because it does matter what you're doing, and it also matters how you do it. But you can't cut out one and think that's going to do the trick. You have to have them both. So we want to have process and content both. But still, so it's not an open and shut case about stories, but I think we have a lot of reason to believe that the stories form the substance of a person's life, and that to the extent that that substance is experienced, one will feel like one has lived a life. There's one particular psychologist who did a very odd thing. He put an ad in the paper, saying anyone who finds that people, now he's talking about non-psychologists. He put an ad in a local newspaper. You know what I mean by putting an ad in the newspaper? An advertisement. And said something like, if people confide in you a lot, I'd like to hear from you, call this number. And he got a large number of people who wrote in saying that people confide in them a lot. And you know people who, there are some people you know, everybody confides in them. They are magnets for stories. And he found that these people were magnets for stories. And I won't go into all the details of their characteristics, because if I do, I'm going to have to look at my paper here, and I'll now lose you. I'm going to choose you over that. Anyway, but what he found was they were honest, they were open-minded, they were non-judgmental, they were fascinated with the stories. And I have said before about being fascinated with the stories that our patients tell us, is that one of the things we're dealing with is that we are setting our own talent in being interested against the patient's talent in being uninteresting. Now, very often the patient will win, but not if you're very talented at being interested. So the more you can open your mind to being interested, the more chance you're going to have with people who, I say uninteresting, I don't mean that they're fundamentally uninteresting. They evade, they distort, they repeat, they skip important parts of the stories, they diminish the impact as they're telling you about it, they won't smile when it's funny. There are a million things they'll do ordinarily that will keep you from being interested unless your talent is greater than theirs. Then, of course, there's always the ability to recognize story potential, which I think I mentioned already. Like one person, I remember, said to me, I called home this morning. My father answered the phone and turned me over to my mother. Well, there's a story there. And any good newspaper reporter would know there's a story there. And any good novelist would know where to find the stories, and sometimes they're hidden a lot more deeply than in this particular moment and in this fairly small example. But you know, when you're dealing with your patients, you can tell when there's a story there. Yeah, another story potential is one guy I was working with. His father was an out-and-out avowed socialist in the days when that meant really quite revolutionary in the United States. This was a long time ago. And, and I didn't mean that as a political statement. I don't even know what it means politically because I wasn't listening when I was talking, but he was a head waiter in an elite restaurant. Now there's a story there, and he wouldn't have told it unless in this case me, in many other cases that you could see the story in that contradiction. And by the time he told it, we could see all kinds of reasons why he was basically pretty paranoid about life, because his father was always talking about these elite people while at the same time being among them and making a living that way and kowtowing to them and honoring them, giving them the best food, the best service, everything they would want. Another source of storyline is the metaphor. And I remember one time going into a group, and there was a man in the group wearing a tall white turban, you know how those might look. And he was totally American looking. He had no Eastern visage or anything of it. Apple cheeks, like he was born in the Midwest and never had a problem in his life. And And here he is wearing this turban. So I said, you know, you look to me like somebody, like you went to a rodeo. And somebody got a whole big string of gauze and threw it at you and lassoed you and wrapped it around your head like that. And he says to me, how did you know? So, what happened was that what he meant by how did you know is that he was lassoed into this cult by the severe pressures of the guru and his wife, and he even told a story about how they had pressured him in an alley that he was in, and they were talking about him. By the time he was done, he had to join the cult. Well, then another way to evoke a story. One story may evoke another. Now, I don't think therapists can regularly tell stories about themselves. I think that would be taking the pressure away from where it belongs. It would be narcissistic. It would probably be ultimately uninteresting. But there are times when the slightest story you might tell about yourself is going to open that person up to telling a story of similar consequence. Like I remember once telling a very shy person about the way I had been in the 4th grade in school, and how I was so shy that, and I adored Miss Morgan. She was the teacher. But she never knew who I was. I never spoke to her. I was only in class for a year. Then she started telling her stories of her own shyness, which were very relevant to her life process, and which were not formed only by my having said what I said. And then, of course, you can set up experiments that will bring stories. Like if you create a scenario or an image, like suppose you say, imagine yourself alone in the desert and see what happens. Well, if one is willing to do that, there will be a story forthcoming, very likely. Or if you say, tell me what has been missing in your life? I mean, did you miss having a brother, or a certain emotion, or a certain solidity, or a certain ease? And the person will then flesh out something centering around what he had missed. So there are a million ways I'm sure you've already dreamt of when you work with people to evoke stories by setting up a scenario which will guide people into the storyline. And then, of course, a major thing is to flesh out generalities. People very often will tell you, and this is primary in therapy, I think, will tell you the titles to the story of their lives and think they told you the stories. So they can tell you about being abused by their father, or being scared by a teacher, or any one of a number of things, and knowing that title it's as though it's enough. And though you might think, as I'm speaking now, that anybody would flesh that out, if you think back to other people, you'll know that many people will not flesh it out. You'll have to ask them, what do you mean by that? I mean, he abused you? What did he do? What did he do? When did he do it? Was anybody else around when he did it? Did he do it frequently? Was he very harsh in doing it? There are a million questions you can ask that will help to flesh out the story, but you have to know that you don't get anywhere by, people come to therapy don't get better by changing the titles to the story of their lives. So you can change the title, and that very often happens with interpretation. You change the title, but you're not changing the story, but you have to change the story. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that stories have many functions, and through the coordination among these functions, they offer an enrichment of living, a directionalism, and an experience of the reality of actually having lived a life. And that's the name of that game. I missed what?
You missed out a part.
Missed what?
You missed a part.
I missed a part?
It doesn't matter.
Which part?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. But
Okay.
it's your exact time.
Perfect.
It's perfect.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions or commentary? Yeah.
I read your book. Every person's life worth for novel. Oh. I read your book, Every Person's Life is Worth of Novel. It is great book, but it is small with volume. I have question. It is great book, great book for me. Because he is written with warmth, heart, and wisdom. But I know Gestalt therapy and Gestalt theory. Accent is on now and here. This is not in this book. You speak about stories, biography, personal history, and so on. Please tell us something about this Wiena. This new things in Gestalt theory.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. The mic is not on now for probably obvious reasons. It's okay now? Okay? Well, thank you for the opportunity because I think that's an important part of the history of Gestalt therapy. And the here and now concept was so magnetic, it was irresistible, even though it was totally inaccurate. Because probably the only thing in life that doesn't exist is the now. Like, when would now be? I mean, is it, well, was it what I just said, or is it going to be, or as I'm speaking, where did you start? You see, you have to pinpoint the now. Now, what the concept of now did, it was a very valuable, I think, contribution to the history of psychotherapy, unfortunately misunderstood. What it did was to say, you must pay attention. You must concentrate. You must take things seriously. You mustn't distort, divert, and so on. And all of that was encompassed within the concept of the here and now. But what kind of a life would it be if everything were here and now? It couldn't happen. So, if people want to talk about now, I think it's a perfectly good word if it is meant as a position in time rather than as a locus of existence. So, for example, if I want to differentiate with you by saying, what I'm saying to you right now doesn't really matter as much as what I said 3 minutes ago. I want you to know there's a difference between what I said 3 minutes ago and what I'm saying now. Well, that's a good language thing. I mean, that differentiates positions. It doesn't tell anything about an existential reality of where your location in life is. And that's how time should be represented in terms of what time is. And now is a point in time, but not a locus of existence. Does that answer your question? Does that sound right to others who may disagree with that position? But you see, what happened was nobody ever intended. You see, if you read what Fritz said when he talked about here and now, he made two important disclaimers, which nobody remembered. One was that remembering was a present experience, and planning was a present experience. It's sort of a cheap trick out, but still, was a way out. If you really paid attention to his having said that, you would know that he wasn't saying you shouldn't remember things in life. He always dealt with past experience. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, that's a great, yes, I'm glad you mentioned it, because you could very easily come away from this thinking that there's nothing in life but stories. What? Say it again? Oh, there is, yes, indeed. There are events.
Anything else? Yeah, I hope you got it. Whether there's anything else in life besides telling stories.
Will you use the microphone?
It does. Now it does work. Yeah. So by listening to the woman before, I thought you have two options: either to live in the here and now, or to tell stories. And beside this, maybe there's nothing left besides telling stories, because the here and now is an illusion.
There are two things that come to my mind in relation to your question. I confess I haven't thought it out carefully, because I've always thought I'm just talking about stories and not really narrowing life to stories, but just thinking of stories as an important part. But it is an interesting question in this respect, I think. First of all, there are many things that are not stories, like this. There may be a story behind this microphone, but this microphone in itself is not a story. The only time something becomes a story is when it becomes connected to other events, and the events show the relationship and develop some kind of meaning about that connection of events. So that's a fundamental of storytelling. But the other factor there is that we in our minds have a threshold for what we are willing to consider a story. So if I tell you I called my mother this morning, your threshold for what constitutes a story may not be reached. So we have our thresholds for that, and I don't think we can set an exact threshold. Sometimes that may feel like a story, because a story has a higher level of interconnectedness and meaning. Usually we think of a story as having a plot, and a beginning and a middle and an end, and so on. It has some action. So there are factors that you could throw in there that I have not really taken account of in this presentation, but they're worth taking into account. And what is it that some of the current writers say when they say there's no more stories left in novels? What are they doing? I always see a story. But does anybody know enough about literature to answer that question? What is meant by the fact that stories are on the way out in literature? No? Okay. But I know I've heard that concept, but I haven't really studied that question. What?
They are not all. They don't go out.
They don't go out?
They're not on their way out.
Okay. You know, I couldn't hear what you said.
So
The
take the
novelists are not
microphone,
able to
please.
tell stories.
I guess the meaning was that the novelists are not able to tell proper stories anymore. They just try, but they are not vivid enough to convince people.
Yeah. Well,
In this way, I understand it, that they are complaining that.
well, but if you don't like not telling a story, factors in our 20th century civilization. I know I'm in the 21st century now because I have a Palm Pilot, so I know. But the 20th century, one of the main things that was happening was, in the arts, was the breakdown of the holistic experience. That everything was broken down into seemingly unrelated parts. And those unrelated parts, if you were perceptive enough, and if they were artful enough, you could reconstruct the broken down parts into a whole. So Picasso's nose and face and ears and other things that went on, you could make a whole out of it. Because he, in a sense, was emphasizing breakdown, but he also was trying to unify that which seems like it could never be unified. And Freud did the same thing with free association. You got all kinds of disconnected experiences which would seem like they're crazy, but through interpretation, they began to make sense, and you could reconstruct the wholeness that the system was breaking down. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
What do you think of some of the narrative approaches and the family reconstructive approaches? What do you think of some of the narrative approaches or the family constellation approaches where they change the stories of the patients or the clients?
Well, I don't know enough about it to be, it's a matter of very careful study of how they do that, but I would imagine that if you change the configurations by changing the stories, you're going to insert a kind of versatility into the mind, that you're suddenly going to discover that the world is rich with story possibilities, and then you may indeed be a part of a lot of them, and you haven't really thought of yourself as being anything other than the familiar story that you're telling yourself. So I would imagine that would be one of the primary contributions, but I'm not really well enough versed to say it definitively. Others here may be able to answer that question better. Did you hear the question? I forgot to, I should have repeated the question.
Die Frage war, wie es die Therapien gestellt ist, in denen Erzählungen verändert werden, zum Beispiel bei Familienaufstellungen, wo dann die Geschichte verändert wird von dem Patienten selbst. Oder narrative Therapie.
Die Antwort, wie war die Antwort bitte? How was the answer? What was the answer? German.
My answer?
No, in German.
Oh, the answer in German?
No. What's your answer, please?
Oh, you wanted me to give my answer then?
Yeah.
What I said was, I'm not familiar enough with the phenomena that Joe was talking about to speak with any great background of study of it and such, but my guess is that by changing the construction of the stories, the more you can encompass a variety of stories of your life, that you might be contributing a certain versatility to your sense of your life, that your life is capable of experiencing many stories beyond those with which you're very familiar, and it broadens your mind. And you may hit on a story that they construct that feels much more valuable to you than the one you've been familiar with living.
Ja, er sagt, er ist nicht so vertraut mit diesen Therapieformen, aber er denkt sich, dass das Erzählen oder das Verändern von Geschichten den Horizont erweitert, einerseits, andererseits die inneren Möglichkeiten der Patientinnen oder der Klientinnen erweitert, ihre Lebensgeschichte neu zu konstruieren.
Yes, please.
I heard you saying that the interpretation is the unifying aspects of the story. But there can often be different interpretations of a story. So the story can have many faces.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Well, it's nice of you to agree. But can you say more?
Yeah, well, if you take, now obviously when you have a novel, you get 5 different reviewers that have a different take on the story. And if you read all 5 reviewers, you probably will be getting a more deep picture of the novel than if you read only one reviewer, unless that one happened to be just right. If you get many interpretations of a patient's story, the first thing is it could be very confusing and everything would cancel each other out. The second thing is if you get only one interpretation, it could very well be wrong. And a lot of people have been sent off on wrong trails by wrong interpretations. So it takes a certain amount of humility on the part of the therapist to make interpretations and perhaps even introducing it with, well, it could be this seems to make sense, but I don't know whether it's really true, what do you think about it, and so on and so on. Then you get a mutuality going on, which would help. And another possibility is that very often interpretations, see, the big problem about interpretations is in terms of how far removed is the interpretation from the experience. So there are some interpretations which is like an apple falling off a tree when it's ripe. And there are others, you take an axe to the tree to get the apples off, and that's a whole different ballgame. So you have to be careful to know that the process through which you're going is heading in a way that it seems most likely that that next thing you would say, which would be called an interpretation, is like the ripe apple falling off a tree. And the more you can do that, the more likely you are to be successful, and the less likely you are to hurt people. But you can't limit yourself to that, because otherwise you might become mute. If it's got to be exactly right, sometimes you have to take a chance in making an interpretation. Sometimes it'll hit just right when it's far removed from the sequence. And other times it's just misleading. And so we have no way to exactly identify the right way to go on that except to express a lot of different options in terms of knowing about people and express a certain amount of humility and yet also a certain amount of risk-taking. So if you take an interpretation which is a little more risk-taking than you might otherwise, in the back of your mind, at the same time you're doing it, you have to say to yourself, this is a little more risky, I better watch out for the consequences. So that you're not just surprised by, I said something that's a little beyond the given, and I better watch out to verify whether I was right or whether I was wrong. And there's a million things you could say about that that would help to do it.
Isn't it a main characteristic of our work to find out the common meaning of the stories the clients are telling us, the common work of the patient and the therapist to work it out, the meaning? This is the one thing. And to the here and now, the here and now for me is working as a background in the way of the therapeutic relationship, which has its history, naturally, and the state of working together.
Liesl, kannst du noch einmal wiederholen die erste Frage, damit ich es übersetzen kann?
Isn't it the main characteristic of our work that we... Bitte? Ach so.
Oh, das sagst du.
Ich sag's auf Deutsch, ja. Ist es nicht ein Hauptmerkmal unserer Arbeit, dass wir die Geschichten, dass wir die Bedeutung von Geschichten, die uns Klienten erzählen, gemeinsam auch finden und erforschen? Das war der erste Teil.
Yeah. Well, the main, if I understand your question, isn't the main... I think the main thing we have is not to make interpretations. I think that's one of our instruments that we should use very carefully because it usually precedes the clarity that you would want from an interpretation. But I think we are dealing with connectedness, and that meaning is the fit between whatever is happening and the context of what's happening. So it has to all fit together, and we try to get the best fit we can get. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Could you repeat the last sentence, please, for me to translate it?
That things need to, we try to find a fit for each experience, not each experience, we don't do this for everything, but selectively where it seems to matter, we want to know where something fits in a person's life. And it may even be where it fits in a sentence. It could be a sentence or a paragraph or this week or a lifetime. But the idea being that we wind up feeling that we are winning the struggle between wholeness and individuation, and that we are winding up all of a piece. That we are one, we are together.
Ja, ich versuch's halt. Die Interpretation oder die Bedeutung ist etwas, was hineinpassen muss in den Lebenskontext. Danke. Und okay, Nancy, hilf mir bitte.
Manchmal nur in den Satz.
Ja. Manchmal nur in den Satz, aber im Allgemeinen oder im Gesamten in den Lebenskontext. Was noch was?
Any other questions? Yes.
No, I just want to repeat my question. No, I leave it.
Maybe you can come up afterwards. And somebody over there wanted to ask a question?
I'm a bit surprised that you say that now doesn't exist. For me, it's a very basic thing in Gestalt therapy. And I thought in the purpose of storytelling, the difference is telling a story or being in a story. Let's say if you're in a theater, if somebody tells you the story of the act, it's quite a difference if the actor does it. And I think that's the purpose of our doing, bringing the client or the patient into being his story. And
Well,
that's the now.
Stop.
Being the story is the now.
Well, the now that I was
Stop, please. I can't remember everything. Die Frage.
Ich sag's.
Ja.
Ich bin überrascht, dass für Sie das jetzt nicht existiert, denn jetzt gerade in Bezugnahme auf die Geschichten, auf die Novel, ist für mich der wesentliche Unterschied in einer Therapie, ob jemand die Geschichte erzählt oder in ihr ist, also sie auch darstellt, gleichermaßen wie wenn auf der Bühne jemand stehen würde und die Geschichte erzählt oder die Schauspieler auftreten. Das ist für mich die Näherung zum Jetzt, wenn jemand darin ist oder es spielt. Deswegen bin ich überrascht.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, there are two things I said about now. One is that, not that it doesn't exist, I did say now is the only thing that doesn't exist. A fairly provocative statement to make in the context was the context of the location of existence being in the now. And in that sense, it doesn't exist. But now exists as a point in time. And we have to specify what time we're talking about when we talk about time. Something may be happening now, or it may have happened yesterday or tomorrow. The other part is that the now, the insistence on the now had the effect of causing people to pay attention, to concentrate, not to be diverted from what's going on. And in that sense, it had a valuable impact. My only objection to the concept of the now is objecting to it as a location of our existence. Does that answer your
Yes.
question?
I try to translate what you said. Das Hier und Jetzt ist ein Konzept, das Erv nicht verwendet wissen will im Sinne eines Ortes im Leben oder einer Situation im Leben, sondern Location in Life, eines Ortes ein Platz im Leben, sondern nur in der Reihe von mehreren von Zeitpunkten einer davon.
Okay, I see that our time is up.
Just
One more
question.
Okay.
Ich möchte den Erv fragen, was seine persönliche Faszination zu diesem Thema ist. You wrote a book about this topic, so I want to ask you, what is your personal fascination about the similarity of a novelist and a therapist? Okay.
Well, I suppose that would take some self-examination. How much time do you have? No, I think it's a natural fascination. We're all fascinated with books, I think. I've been fascinated with novels since I was a boy. It's true, they were cheap novels, but they were still novels. And the idea of a novelist creating a life and being able to furnish a mind that is empty to begin with is in itself a fascinating prospect, in addition which it's their business to be fascinating. Otherwise we wouldn't read the book. So when they give me some very dramatic story, I go, yeah. So it's just, but it's no more surprising than being fascinated with a person. Like, I can be very fascinated with a person. You can too. The question is, can we be fascinated with a person and still keep our minds with us? Because the difference...
Could you stop here, please?
One of the main difference... What?
Could you stop here, please?
Wait, just one more thing. One of the main differences between a novel and therapy is that in a novel, you are allowed to have, in fact, it's very often welcome, you're allowed tragedy. In therapy, you're not allowed tragedy. You might get it in spite of everything you can do, but it's certainly nothing you would foster.
Ja, ich fange...
I only wish that I had one of my caps to wear right now.
Erv, I want to thank you from the depth of my heart for your stimulating speech and welcome you back out of retirement and into the Gestalt community.